Okay, so I'm going to just give a quick overview of what this talk is going to be so that you can know if you're at the right place also. This is a talk where I'm talking about how we migrated a few plugins from Theia plugins to become VSCode VSIX plugins. And there were several things that cost us a lot of money and time to do, and a lot of investigation. So we want to give you shortcuts so that if you ever have to do it, it will take you less time. The recipes, you can reach out to me afterwards, and they are on public GitHub, of course. So without further ado, I want to just give some quick context. If you take a look back, and this is Trace Compass. For all of those people that have a little more legacy behind them, they might remember Eclipse TMF, Tracing and Monitoring Framework. Now this was the first Eclipse project that we worked on for being able to visualize LTTNG traces, Linux Trace Toolkit Next Generation. Now, it was able to do some cool stuff. It had some timeline charts, it had some histograms, and it was able to read files. Life was good. Then after that, we graduated to become Eclipse Trace Compass when we forked out of Linux tools. This was a complete project, a complete package. It had its RCP releases. It had everything from before. It also added XY plots, and it had separated the compute into an analysis instead of having it being a custom solution every time. And it started being able to scale really well. How well, you ask? Terabyte well. Then we added the sprouting incubator. And here we have all the cool stuff that students contribute or that easily excitable people contribute, such as ROS2, ROS traces, ROCm, which is the AMD compute traces, OTF2, which is Intel vTune traces, Jaeger support, ftrace, uftrace, two trace formats made by completely different people for different solutions, perf, trace events, which is the Chromium trace format, and really, there are too many to list, so I'm just going to put etc. And one other really cool thing is that there was a beginning of a push to have all of the data accessible in a RESTful way. So we have a trace server now. Now after that, the vision was that we can bring this to a trace extension in Theia. So we made a Theia trace extension. Huge thanks to Typefox and particularly to Jan for making such a great timeline viewer. We also have a huge thanks to Polytechnique Montréal, who have been doing a lot of research and allowed us to have a backend that works pretty well with that. Then afterwards, we had the XY chart that was the first thing to populate it. And in fact, if you went to Maximilian's EMF Cloud talk, you might have seen a trace compass with an XY plot in it. We are taking advantage of web-based tech. What does that mean? We get WebGL, we get easier plotting, we get React items. If you ever make a mistake, you can press Control-Z and it works really quickly and easily. Cool stuff. And then it was so amazing that we were begged to join CDT Cloud. And so we branded Trace Compass Cloud. And it's part of that project. That's where it's being hosted now, which is much better because before it was just some random GitHub. We weren't really compliant. And honestly, I think you all noticed, software is starting to enter adulthood. Open source is starting to enter adulthood. We need to we need to do our IP due diligence. We need to make something that we're allowed to deliver and securely know that you won't get hacked or sued for it. So yeah, very good. Then afterwards, there was demand for going to VS Code. Why am I putting this plot here? I want you to understand the context that we're living in. We have 14 years of code and 3 migrations that need to go to VS Code. So, why do we have to go VS Code? This might be something that you're these might be problems that might make you want to go VS Code. Theia extensions are statically linked. You got to do a bug fix, you got to recompile and rebuild everything, and you got to redistribute everything. So, because of that, your releases are lockstepped. If there's a bug in the platform, you make a release. If there's a bug in your plugin, you make a release. This is an n-squared problem. You don't want this. Now, the performance could have been better, but not the performance of the software. The performance of the release engineering. We were spending a lot of time on making sure that everything works together in one shot now. We were too tightly coupled. And one other thing is that some people were saying, hey, I'm using VSCode, I want to use Trace Compass. And some people were saying, I want Theia and I want Trace Compass. Well, guess what? Theia supports the VSCode API. Again, in case there's ever a question or doubt, Theia supports the VSCode API. Now, VSCode and Theia, VSCode also supports the VSCode API. CodeOSS and VSCodium are the open source bases for VSCode. They also support the VSCode API. Our friends at Che, if they're using Theia or VSCode, they need something that's supported too. CDC Cloud, Theia Cloud, Blueprint, they support the VSCode API. So yeah, if you have friends that are working in Eclipse Core, it might be a really cool thing that Eclipse also adds support for the VS Code API. So yeah, one thing that I cannot underestimate, and I've already mentioned it, Theia supports the VS Code API, but they reached 1.80, and Jupyter Notebooks and the test API are in. Like, we did it. We caught up with 2 years of tech debt in 4 months about. That's an accomplishment. But here, so we're going to go VS Code API. VSIX, that's their format. But what happens if we do? We'll get wider adoption. Cool. It's dynamically loaded. Cool. It removes workload from the integrating team. Why is that bold? This one represents real, tangible savings for companies. Like, I like eating, so I like getting paid for what I do. Everyone seems to agree with that philosophy. Next up, what are the things that we have to do? We have to re-architect many items. And so in VS Code, every window is a web view. What does that mean? Now you have to rethink all your inter-view communication if you have several views. You need to figure out if we're allowed to put on the VS Code marketplace or the OpenVSX registry. You know, when you're in a company and the company has lawyers, it's stuff that you have to make sure of. And there are several technical limitations where we were just going, how can we do this? Because the VS Code API is designed for IDEs, and Theia, you can pretty much do anything in it. So let's start with a simple extension, the VS Code Memory Inspector. Now, from what I've been told by the team that was working on it, it was incredibly straightforward and very easy to get to a VS Code API level, to make it into a VS Code API. And why is that? It's one window. Since it's one window, it's very simple to do because there's no inter-view communication, and all the logic applies to what's inside that window. But Trace Compass, remember how I showed that timeline and it was big and complicated? You don't need to read this. I'm just giving random examples of why it's complicated. Pick your favorite. That's mine. So, what's our reason to develop Trace Compass? Why do we need such a big, complicated thing? Ericsson makes antennas, right? If you're trying to troubleshoot, you have two choices, really. You can debug or trace. Printf, I'm going to pretend doesn't exist. If you debug, you need a breakpoint. A breakpoint stops the world. If you have two antennas and one has a breakpoint, you have one antenna. A single antenna is useless. We are dealing with a complicated distributed system. We need something that is a non-blocking solution. So why don't we just support one tracer? Because all of our vendors speak different languages and supply different trace formats. We need to be able to adapt. And, you know, everyone has their own tracing standard, unfortunately. There have been efforts to unify, but there is CTF, which is the common trace format, and within the Eclipse Foundation, there's also BTF, which, anyone want to guess what it stands for? Best trace format. I'm not joking, look it up. So, you know, we are announcing that we are doing a strategic shift towards ORAN. This means that we have more reliability constraints. So we need to troubleshoot fast on the field. And for the developers, then we have this main Tower of Babel problem. So Trace Compass' game is take all the formats, make them into an IR, or intermediate representation, which then passes through compute modules and then can display the results. But the transition to Theia was not fast because we had a team of a certain size. I know that all of you have teams of infinite size, but we were stuck with a certain size, and we had to support the old product and develop the new product. You know, also, we got a few people saying, out of my cold dead hands, will you take the old product? So there's also that human factor that we have to convince people to go to the new product, and we're not going to convince them to go to something worse. We need to make good, unique selling points. And of course, okay, this is a very specific to Ericsson thing. I know no one here has ever heard this from anyone. Can't all my demands be top priority? It was very difficult to prioritize when everyone was saying that their demand was number one. This has been solved, but this is something that I will not that I think everyone has to have their own solution for. So Theia allowed us to have a back end, and it allowed us to be able to work on our system and connect to our custom trace server. This provided some confusion within the development team sometimes when we would be discussing the trace server, which is a backend, and the Theia backend. So we have two backends now. But we had to launch the trace server, and we used the Theia backend for that one. So that was not that was more difficult to do with VSCode, which does not have the same backend. There is inter-view communication or inter-window communication that I've mentioned earlier. Theia is very simple and very flexible. You know, you can just, honestly, quite often you could just say, I need to do X. What is the logical way for me to do X? And then you look in Theia and, oh, there's an X adapter that's doing exactly what I needed to do. And, you know, gave us port forwarding. That was really easy to be able to work on cloud-based architectures. So here's some hurdles to any migration. This is not just Theia VSCode. This is anything. You need to convince your stakeholders that there is going to be a loss of velocity while you're doing the migration. You can't continue delivering features at the same speed as before and do new stuff. Like you have a 10-pound bag of macaroni. You can't fit 20 pounds of macaroni in it. And that's very important to say. A migration is not free. People need to understand that they are going to pay for this. That sounded ominous. I meant that it has a cost. We need to know what we are supporting, just because that's very important also, that if you're in a larger company, maybe they vetted version 1.6 of VS Code or Theia, and then if those are the only versions available, you need to make sure that your APIs fit with those. You can't just base on head and tell them, well, go upgrade. So yeah, we have a lower bound and an upper bound on our API. This doesn't matter for you. Theia caught up with the API. It didn't matter for us, but we are very lucky. We have a Theia development team internal to Ericsson, and we've contributed some VSCode APIs. But basically, because of this, we were able to prioritize. If you need to do that, you might want to consider getting a team to help uplift APIs, but that would be for another project. Theia, this problem is under control, but always looking for new friends. Next up, for VSIX, the VSCode API is more secure than Theia's API. This, I think, is objectively true in the sense that I could do a lot of worse things in Theia than VSCode. However, the reason VSCode's API is so secure is because anyone can dynamically load a plugin into VSCode, whereas in Theia, it has to be built by the developer so they know what's going on. And you can do a heck of a lot more in Theia. You know, it's basically you have that slider of security versus customizability. Now, because of dynamic loading, you really don't want anyone to access all the internals. Like, the last thing you want to do is open up Code OSS and just put a backdoor with a VSIX API or something on it. That would be just dangerous. So instead, you would be able to use, you use the proper APIs that are supplied to you. Now, since every window is a web view, and every web view is unable to access the hard drive and doesn't really access the UI thread, that's another constraint that we had. So you got to be careful for those items. But here are the actual fun items that might affect you. First off, in cloud deployments, using port forwarding forwarding works with SSH remote or remote SSH in Theia, but there are programmatic issues, or there are issues to programmatically stop and start port forwarding in VS Code that we had to solve by making a second plugin. So, you know, if you want to do some extra control, you might need to make several plugins to make one Theia plugin. Don't be scared of that. Next up, and this one is a doozy for us. Now, Trace Compass handles time, and we handle time in nanoseconds. So this number here, at the time of the writing, was the amount of nanoseconds since epoch. TypeScript handles doubles. Nothing should be bigger than a double. Double has a precision of 2 to the 53 max, which means this would have about 1,000 of error. That's not really acceptable when you're trying to figure out the nanosecond problem to have a 1 microsecond error on your timestamps. But not, so we needed to have this kind of data. We used the big int library. The big int library serializes to this string. Long serializes to this string. This kind of logic, we needed to add a lot of extra logic for the inter-message communication, because if not, because you cannot cast a long to a big int. We had to make sure that we knew that we were big ints here. So this is something to be very careful about. It was a very annoying problem to figure out. And once we figured it out, we used the resolvers that we also use on the Java to Theia side, and that worked. But you know, expect surprises of lost in translations in your interview messaging. Next up, this one's a fun one too. Okay, in Theia, you have a window in VS Code window. You minimize that window. You bring it back up. What happens? Your data's still there. With VS Code, you take the data, you put it in the window, you minimize, bring it back up. The state is cleared. I was reviewing a patch, and I tested it in Theia, and it worked, and I approved. And then I tested in VS Code, and it didn't, and I panicked. So you need to have a way of keeping your state. I'm going to recommend you look at React set state or some equivalent for that one. Next up, remote SSH was an issue. our friends at Typefox are working on it right now. It is a really cool feature. If you can either access a time machine or YouTube, watch Mark Suyev's talk on it. This is a really big one. VSCode is designed to be an IDE, not a platform. So, you know, dialogues, wizards, all that jazz, they need to be web views, and we need to rethink a lot of these things. Like, Theia allows us to do anything again. So we could do anything. VSCode is a little more restrictive. So aside from that, you know, you have a paradigm shift where we were trying to maintain certain UX flows for our Eclipse warriors, which now needed to be rethought. So yeah, there are options that exist, and you know, the UX nerds out there will be very happy to try these out. One that was a little difficult for me personally was that there are no modal dialogues, which meant that you couldn't freeze things and make sure that the person answers your question before working. But I lied. There is a modal dialogue. There is the file dialogue, which your OS makes modal, which sometimes pops behind the VS Code window. So that one's an interesting one. I'm sure you've all hit that one. Multiple workspace supports. So Visual Studio contribution extensions do not support multiple workspaces. So we used Webpack as a workaround. You need to be careful about these kind of things. You know, you want to use some third-party packages. It's actually pretty important. I put the patch here, or the pull request here, that solved it for adding icons to the VS Code extension. So what I'm telling you, if you hit a problem where you try to bring in a library or a package and it doesn't work, take a peek at that. Maybe it's going to help you. But that being said, reuse your code. If you have a Theia extension, I am ready to guarantee that you're not going to have to do a complete rewrite. It's already in TypeScript. And if you have no business logic, you'll have to do a complete rewrite, but I would question if my... Thanks, Linus. I would sincerely question, if you have no business logic, why you have a plugin. So yeah, we've added our VS Code extensions to the repo. Please check out the VS Code Trace extension if you want to see the path. I mean, you could look at our Git history, and it's been a 6-month journey so far, a little more. If you so, consider that could be a Stack Overflow without people answering that you asked the wrong question. We need the second repo for the trace server control, so you got to be careful for that. We did not need a third repo yet, so that's good. And so our final result was that Theia works great with the VS Code extension. I say sometimes a bit too well, because sometimes I was testing on Theia and things worked perfectly, and then I went to VS Code and things kind of worked perfectly-ish, I guess. Now, multi-VSX support allows you to do internal upgrades on an inner VSX. This is a very cool thing with Theia also, and this is one of those advantages that you can have by using VSX plugins within Theia. Remember, this talk is about migrating to VSX from a Theia plugin for the advantage of Theia. So you can actually handle, and I've mentioned this a few times, an open source project with a thin layer of your company name here, Paint, on your inner VSX. Meanwhile, you can have the people install the other one easily. Theia's support for secondary windows works on VSX icons, or VS Code plugins. So we got multi-window support there. That was actually a really nice quality of life feature, especially for those people that have more than one monitor. And the toolbar option allows you to synergize with these two. Like Theia has a really good toolbar for that. So we actually had some really good workflows capturing the best of both worlds by using Trace Compass and Theia together. So yeah, lessons learned. Migration is not going to be cheap. You should know what you're going to get into. If it's a simple one-window solution, or if you have a simple one-window plugin, it's going to be easy. I think we have Robin back that's also a committer on the memory inspector, so that's a good example of that. But something complicated like Theia, like Trace Compass, that one, you should know what you're going to get into, and don't hesitate to reach out to the community. We can at least help share our war stories. One good place for that would be the Theia Dev community meetings. Another one would be Cloud Dev Tools. So yeah, thank you. This is my talk. I think we have time for questions. Thank you. Yes.
Maybe back in the past, can you estimate the bits that have been the effort to migrate from the legacy Eclipse Compass?
Okay, this is a complicated question because we're doing lots of things at the same time, right? I would say that it took us, for Trace Compass, which has 1.5 million lines of Java code, and a lot of UI integration, so there was a lot of work of decoupling and everything, about 2 man-years, person years. We are not feature equivalent, and we do not want to be feature equivalent. We were stuck with Eclipse way of working on many things. And we want to take advantage of Theia to deliver the things that brought more value. We can do stuff in Theia, like Eclipse, you're bound to the editor, right? And all the views are auxiliary, which means that you have to show your events, which is the most detailed item. It's bad UX to show the most detail first. With Theia, we show the overview first. And we can customize the overview because that's the view that people will look at first. So it should be customized so that you can know which flow you want to get into. So that being said, we went in a different direction, but we tried to retain the good things of Trace Compass. And as its biggest cheerleader, I can say there are many good things to it. Thank you. Any other questions? Philip. Oh. So that is an excellent question. Now, there is a conference coming up called TheiaCon, I believe, and it is an excellent place to learn about Theia. And I'm going to be giving a demo using Eclipse Classic, tracing Theia, to show where the start time, or where the time was spent on start times in Theia, bringing the best of both worlds, in my opinion. It will be showing the beautiful React widgets, having better UX in Theia, and flame graphs. Was there a question or head scratching in back? Okay.
Maybe I asked you, but I enjoyed it a little today, but I was wondering about, I saw that for VSCode, red hatting has like end-to-end. Do you think it might be something feasible like in the future, maybe the end to have something similar? Because at the end it's kind of like selecting.
Well, so the question is about end-to-end testing in Theia. Now, there are some tests already in place. I know about Playwright, which is a really cool tool for that. There is, in fact, the end-to-end performance test that's come out recently, and that one, I don't remember the GitHub name, but it's in my links. Quick Google search will help. But yes, stabilization is a big priority for Theia. I'm getting off topic, but I want to get off topic. Theia right now has Theia Blueprint. We want to harden Theia to a point where we can have a Theia IDE. Because what's the website that you go to get Theia? TheiaIDE.org. And then the first thing that we have to explain is Theia's not an IDE, it's a framework. No, we want it to be an IDE. And that way, people will just treat it as the proper commodity like it is. And it will be hardened to that point. And it'll be so cool. Thank you. Excellent question. Miro.
You mentioned security of
Yes. Security by, so the security, I'm going to say security by restriction. Yes.
Restriction like on the UI or something. But
Yeah.
I see a little bit more like a restriction, intentional restriction of what we don't fiddle around with our VSCode by Microsoft API. Because the VSCode extension has a full Node.js API, can do anything on the machine.
That is an excellent point. I'm going to repeat it. So the security on the VS Code API is more about brand security, where it's don't remove my widgets. I want to show my widgets. And there are ways that you can still do very naughty things with it. I would argue that that Theia has the VS Code API, and that it also has the Theia API. So it's by its nature, by having those two permissive APIs, it is less secure. But I would say that this is if and only if you stick to the VS Code API. Like, I could imagine some people might modify that API because they have Code OSS. That could be worse than everything. Is that a good follow-up, or? Okay. Any other questions? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor and a privilege to say this is my last talk at this EclipseCon. And thank you very much.